Sergeant Jake Thompson wasn't hunting deer in a Montana woods that day. He was hunting answers. What he found: a crash pod and her. A girl who glowed like moonlight, with eyes like shattered galaxies. She warned him they were coming. Her people, to strip Earth bare. Now, Jake must choose. Trust this alien stranger or watch his world burn. But here's the thing, she's lying. Where is she? Before we start, please, please subscribe to the channel by clicking card button on top right corner and hit the notification bell so you can get daily stories at bedtime. Let's dive into the story. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Sergeant Jake Thompson heard the explosion. The ground shook beneath his boots, and the birds scattered from the trees like shards of glass breaking in slow motion. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in the middle of the dense, shadowy woods of Pine Ridge, Montana. But something about that sound, that deep, unnatural rumble, pulled him forward like a magnet. Little did he know, this was the moment his life would change forever. Jake tightened the strap of his backpack and adjusted his rifle. The air smelled burnt, like ozone and singed metal. His heart pounded as he pushed through the underbrush, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. The forest was eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had been on patrols before, but this was different. This wasn't a bear or a lost hiker. This was something bigger. And then he saw it. A massive crater, still smoking, lay in the middle of a clearing. The trees around it were bent and broken, their trunks blackened. In the center of the crater was a strange, metallic pod, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a plane crash. This was something else entirely. "What the?" he muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on his rifle. He approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft, scorched earth. The pod hissed, and a seam appeared along its side, splitting open with a soft whir. Jake's finger hovered over the trigger, his muscles tense. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Out stepped a figure, small, slender, and definitely not human. She looked like a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, with skin that glowed faintly, like moonlight on water. Her hair was a cascade of silver strands that seemed to move on their own, as if alive. Her eyes were large and almond-shaped, a deep, swirling blue that made Jake feel like he was staring into the ocean. She wore a sleek, form-fitting suit that shimmered like the pod, and her hands, long, delicate fingers, were raised in surrender. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I mean you no harm." Jake blinked, his mind racing. What are you?" "My name is Kayla," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "And I need your help." Jake didn't lower his rifle. "Help with what? What are you doing here?" Kayla glanced over her shoulder at the pod, her expression tense. "I didn't mean to come here. My pod was damaged. I crashed, and now they'll find me." "They?" Jake's voice sharpened. "Who's they?" Kayla hesitated, her glowing fingers curling into fists. "My people. They're not like me. They don't care about your world. They'll take what they want and leave nothing behind." Jake's stomach churned. He didn't know if he could trust her, but something in her eyes, something desperate and sincere, made him pause. "Why should I believe you?" Kayla took a step closer, her movements graceful but deliberate. "Because if you don't, your world won't survive. And neither will I." Jake stared at her, his mind spinning. This was insane. Impossible. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, real and undeniable. He lowered his rifle slightly, though he didn't let his guard down. "All right," he said slowly. "But if you're lying to me, I'm not," Kayla interrupted, her voice firm. "I swear it." Jake nodded, though his heart was still pounding. "Fine. Let's get out of here before whoever's after you shows up." Kayla glanced at the pod one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Jake and nodded. "Lead the way." As they disappeared into the trees, the forest seemed to exhale, the tension easing just slightly. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. Whatever was coming, It was bigger than anything he'd ever faced. And Kayla, she was the key to it all. Jake didn't know why he trusted her. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. Or maybe it was the way she seemed so human, despite her otherworldly appearance. Whatever it was, he couldn't leave her there. He led her to his cabin, a small, rustic hideaway deep in the woods. It wasn't much, but it was safe for now. Kayla moved gracefully, her steps almost silent, as if she were floating. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were deliberate, her voice melodic. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the hearth. Jake tossed another log on a fire, the sparks dancing upward like tiny fireflies. Kayla sat on the edge of the worn couch, her glowing fingers tracing the edge of the blanket he'd given her. She looked out of place in the rustic setting, like a star that had fallen from the sky and landed in the middle of the forest. "Where are you from?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. He kept his tone casual, but his eyes never left her. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Kayla hesitated, her gaze fixed on the flames. "A place far from here, a world you wouldn't understand." "Try me," Jake said, sitting across from her. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my time. This might just top the list." Kayla's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "My people are explorers. We traveled to different worlds, learning about them. But something went wrong. My pod was damaged, and I crashed here." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Explorers, huh? So what? You like some kind of space tourist?" Kayla shook her head, her silver hair shimmering in the firelight. "It's not like that. We don't come for fun. We come to observe, to learn. But not everyone thinks the way I do." Jake's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" Kayla looked down at her hands, her glow dimming slightly. "Some of my people see your world as a resource, something to be taken. They don't care about the life here. They only care about what they can use." Jake's stomach churned. "So what? They're coming here? To Earth?" Kayla nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Soon. And when they do, they won't stop until they've taken everything." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "This is insane. How do I know you're not just making this up? How do I know you're not one of them?" Kayla's gaze didn't waver. "If I were one of them, you'd already be dead." Jake stared at her, his jaw tightening. She had a point. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's say I believe you. What do we do? How do we stop them?" Kayla leaned forward, her voice low but urgent. "We need to stay hidden. If they find out I've told you, they'll kill us both. But we can't just hide forever. I can teach you how to stop them, but it won't be easy." Jake clenched his fists, his mind spinning. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. "Then what do we do?" Kayla's expression softened, just for a moment. "We fight, but not with guns or bombs. With knowledge. I can show you how to disrupt their technology, how to weaken them. But you have to trust me." Jake let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "All right, but if you're lying to me, I'm not," Kayla said firmly. "I swear it." Jake nodded, though his heart was still pounding. He didn't know what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his world. And Kayla, she was the only one who could help him save it. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than anything he'd ever faced. And Kayla, she was the key to it all. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of Kayla's voice. She was standing by the window, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She looked worried. Her glow seemed dimmer than the night before, and her shoulders were tense, as if she were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "What is it?" Jake asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He sat up on the couch, his muscles stiff from the uncomfortable night. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin felt colder than usual. Kayla didn't turn around. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can feel them." Jake stood, his heart skipping a beat. He joined her at the window, squinting against the morning light. In the distance, a strange, dark cloud was forming, swirling like a storm, but with an unnatural, almost mechanical precision. It wasn't like any weather he'd ever seen. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight. "A scout ship," Kayla said, her tone grim. "They're looking for me, and for anything they can use." Jake's mind raced. "We need to warn someone. The military, the government, someone." Kayla shook her head, her silver hair shimmering as she turned to face him. "No. If they find out I've told you, they'll kill us both. We need to stay hidden. For now." Jake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. "Then what do we do? Just sit here and wait for them to find us?" Kayla's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "We fight, but not with guns or bombs. With knowledge. I can teach you how to stop them, but it won't be easy." Jake stared at her, his jaw tightening. "All right, teach me." Kayla nodded, her gaze flickering back to the window. The dark cloud was growing larger, more defined. It was coming closer. "First, you need to understand their technology. It's advanced, but it has weaknesses. If we can disrupt their systems, we can slow them down." Jake frowned. "Disrupt their systems? How? I'm not exactly a tech genius." Kayla turned to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "You don't need to be. I'll show you, but you have to trust me." Jake hesitated, his mind spinning. Trusting her felt like a leap of faith, but what choice did he have? "All right," he said finally. "Show me." Kayla reached into a small pouch on her belt and pulled out a sleek, cylindrical device. It was about the size of a flashlight, but its surface shimmered like the pod she'd arrived in. She handed it to Jake, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. Her touch was cool, almost electric. "This is a disruptor," she explained. "It emits a pulse that interferes with their systems. It won't destroy them, but it will buy us time." Jake turned the device over in his hands, his brow furrowed. "How do I use it?" Kayla stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "You aim it at their ship and activate it, but you have to be precise. One shot is all you'll get." Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the device. "All right, let's practice." Kayla's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good, but we need to hurry. They're getting closer." As they moved to the center of the cabin, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in his chest. The dark cloud outside was a constant reminder of what was coming. And Kayla, she was his only hope. But as he looked at her, he noticed something else. Her glow was fading, her movements slower, heavier. She was weakening. "What's happening to you?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Kayla sighed, her shoulders slumping. "My body isn't meant for this world. The longer I stay here, the weaker I become. I don't have much time left." Jake's chest tightened. "Then we need to hurry." Kayla nodded, her expression resolute. "We will. But first, you need to learn. And you need to be ready." As they began their training, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than anything he'd ever faced. And Kayla, she was the key to it all. But time was running out for both of them. Over the next few days, Kayla showed Jake things he could hardly believe. She taught him about her people's technology, their weaknesses, and their plans. The cabin became their makeshift classroom, with Kayla explaining complex concepts in a way that Jake could understand. She showed him how to use the small, handheld disruptor device, its sleek surface cool to the touch. It looked like a simple metal rod, but in the right hands, it was a weapon. "This won't destroy them," Kayla warned as she handed it to him. "But it will buy us time." Jake practiced with the device, learning to aim and activate it with precision. It wasn't easy. His hands were clumsy compared to Kayla's, but he was determined. He had to be. Every time he missed the target, a makeshift dummy they'd set up in the clearing, Kayla would correct him with patience that surprised him. "Focus," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The disruptor isn't like your rifle. It doesn't rely on force. It relies on timing. You have to anticipate their movements. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his frustration growing. I'm trying, but this thing isn't exactly user-friendly. Kayla stepped closer, her glowing fingers brushing his as she adjusted his grip on the device. You're thinking too hard. Trust your instincts. You're a soldier, aren't you? Use that training. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he aimed again. This time, the pulse from the disruptor hit the dummy dead center, causing it to flicker and distort as if it were glitching. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Got it. Kayla nodded, her expression softening. Good. But remember, in a real fight, you won't get a second chance. One shot is all you'll have. As they trained, Jake noticed something else. Kayla was changing. Her glow, once bright and steady, was fading. Her movements, once fluid and effortless, were becoming slower, heavier. She was weakening, and it scared him. What's happening to you? He asked one evening as they sat by the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows on her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes. Kayla sighed, her shoulders slumping. My body isn't meant for this world. The longer I stay here, the weaker I become. I don't have much time left. Jake's chest tightened. Then we need to hurry. We need to stop them before it's too late. Kayla looked at him, her swirling blue eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. We will, but you need to be ready. They're not like anything you've faced before. They're fast, they're ruthless, and they won't hesitate to kill you. Jake leaned forward, his voice low but steady. If faced vers. Kayla raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. Have you? Jake chuckled despite himself. Okay, maybe not worse, but I'm not going down without a fight. Kayla's smile faded, her expression turning serious. Good, because this isn't just about you or me. This is about your world. If they succeed, there won't be anything left. Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. I get it, but what about you? If we stop them, what happens to you? Kayla looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the disruptor. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. What matters is stopping them. Jake wanted to argue, to tell her that it did matter, but he knew she was right. They didn't have time for doubts or second-guessing. Every moment they spent training, every second they prepared, brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation. And as much as he hated to admit it, Kayla was the only one who could help him win. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The dark cloud on the horizon was a constant reminder of what was coming. And Kayla, she was his only hope. But as he watched her, her glow dimming with each passing hour, he knew they were fighting against more than just her people. They were fighting against time itself. We'll stop them, Jake said finally, his voice firm. No matter what it takes. Kayla looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. I know we will. But deep down, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of victory might be higher than either of them was willing to pay. The scout ship arrived at dusk. It hovered above the trees, a massive, black shape blotting out the stars. Jake and Kayla watched from the edge of the clearing, their breaths shallow. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound, every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a distant bird feel like a warning. Jake's grip tightened on the disruptor, his knuckles white. Kayla stood beside him, her glow faint but steady, her eyes locked on the ship. Remember, Kayla whispered, her voice barely audible. Aim for the center. One shot is all you'll get. Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his ears. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he pushed the fear aside. This was it. No more practice. No more second chances. The ship descended slowly, its engines humming like a swarm of bees. The ground beneath them vibrated, and Jake's stomach churned. He had faced danger before, firefights, ambushes, close calls, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting everything he knew. Then the doors opened. Figures emerged, tall, armored, and terrifying. They moved with a precision that sent chills down Jake's spine. Their suits were sleek and black, their faces hidden behind helmets that reflected the dim light. They carried weapons unlike anything Jake had ever seen, glowing with an eerie blue light. "Now!" Kayla hissed, her voice urgent. Jake stepped forward, raised the disruptor, and fired. A beam of light shot out, striking the ship's hull. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ship shuddered, its lights flickering. The figures froze, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. "It's working!" Jake shouted, a surge of hope flooding through him. But Kayla wasn't celebrating. She was on her knees, her glow almost gone. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as she clutched her chest. "Jake," she whispered, her voice faint. "You have to go. They'll send more. You can't fight them all." Jake knelt beside her, his hands trembling. "I'm not leaving you." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "You have to, for your world, for mine." Jake shook his head, his throat tight. "No, there has to be another way." Kayla reached up, her hand brushing his cheek. Her touch was cool, almost electric. "There isn't, but you can still stop them. You have the disruptor. You know what to do." Jake's mind raced. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. But the ship was still hovering, its systems disrupted but not destroyed. The figures were starting to move again, their jerky motions becoming more fluid. Time was running out. "Go," Kayla said, her voice firm despite its weakness. "Now!" Jake hesitated, his heart tearing in two. But he knew she was right. He couldn't save her and stop them at the same time. He stood, his grip tightening on the disruptor. "I'll come back for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I promise." Kayla smiled weakly, her glow flickering like a dying flame. "I know you will." Jake turned and ran, his boots pounding against the ground. The forest blurred around him, his focus narrowing to the ship ahead. He could hear the figures behind him, their footsteps growing louder. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he raised the disruptor and fired again. The beam struck the ship's core, and this time, the effect was immediate. The ship's lights went out, its engines sputtering. It tilted precariously, then crashed to the ground with a deafening roar. Jake ducked behind a tree, his chest heaving. The figures were still coming, but without the ship, they were disoriented. He had bought himself some time, but what cost? He glanced back toward the cabin, his heart aching. Kayla was still out there, alone and weakening. He had made her a promise, and he intended to keep it. But first, he had to finish this. As the dust settled and the forest fell silent, Jake knew this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, and Kayla, she was the key to it all. But time was running out for both of them. Jake carried Kayla back to the cabin, her body light as a feather in his arms. Her glow was almost gone, her silver hair dull and lifeless. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. He laid her gently on the bed, his hands trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, casting the room in a dim, flickering light. Jake's mind raced, searching for a solution, for anything that could save her. "Listen to me," Kayla whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached up, her hand brushing his cheek. Her touch was cool, almost electric, but her strength was fading fast. "There's a way to stop them, but it will cost you." Jake leaned closer, his heart pounding. "What is it? Tell me." Kayla's eyes, once a deep, swirling blue, were now clouded with pain. "You have to destroy the pod. It's the key to their power. But once it's gone, I won't survive." Jake's chest tightened, his stomach churning. "No, there has to be another way." Kayla shook her head weakly, her silver hair spilling across the pillow. "This is the only way. You have to choose, Jake. Me or your world." Jake stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they'd been through. But he couldn't let her people destroy his world, either. The weight of the choice pressed down on him, crushing him. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." Kayla's lips twitched into a faint smile, her hand slipping from his cheek to rest on the blanket. "You won't lose me. Not really. I'll always be with you. But you have to do this. For both of us." Jake clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't afford to fall apart. "Not now. Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Kayla's gaze softened, her eyes locking onto his. "Go to the pod. Use the disruptor. Aim for the core. It will destroy the pod and weaken them. But you have to hurry. They'll come for it soon." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. He stood, his resolve hardening. "I'll come back for you," he said, his voice firm. "I promise." Kayla's smile faded, her eyes closing as she let out a slow breath. "I know you will." Jake turned and ran, his boots pounding against the wooden floor. He grabbed the disruptor from the table and burst out of the cabin, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. The forest was silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves under his feet as he sprinted toward the crater. The pod was still there, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Jake's heart raced as he approached, his grip tightening on the disruptor. He could feel the weight of Kayla's words pressing down on him, the enormity of what he was about to do. He raised the disruptor, aiming for the pod's core. His hands were steady, his focus razor-sharp. But as he prepared to fire, a voice echoed in his mind. Kayla's voice, soft but insistent. "You have to choose, Jake. Me or your world." Jake's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath catching in his throat. He thought of Kayla, her courage, her kindness, her sacrifice. He thought of his world, of the people who had no idea what was coming. And he knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he fired. The beam struck the pod's core, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the pod exploded in a burst of light, the shockwave knocking Jake off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs. The world around him blurred, the sound of the explosion ringing in his ears. When he finally managed to sit up, the pod was gone. The crater was empty, the ground scorched and smoking. Jake's heart ached as he realized what he'd done. He had saved his world, but at what cost? He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky, and ran back to the cabin. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, sorrow. But as he burst through the door, his heart sank. Kayla was gone. All that remained was a faint, silver glow, like stardust drifting in the air. Jake sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had made her a promise, and he had kept it, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. As the days passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Kayla's sacrifice wasn't the end. The dark cloud had disappeared, but something lingered, a whisper in the wind, a glimmer in the stars. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Jake stood at the edge of the crater, the disruptor still clutched in his hand. The pod was gone, reduced to nothing but ash and smoke. The forest around him was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. He felt numb, his mind replaying the last moments with Kayla over and over. Her faint smile, her whispered words, the way her glow had flickered like a dying flame. She was gone, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with him. He turned and made his way back to the cabin, his steps heavy. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the dim light from the hearth casting long shadows on the walls. The cabin felt emptier now, the silence pressing in on him. He sank into the chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. The disruptor lay on the table in front of him, its surface still shimmering faintly. "You did it," a voice said softly. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew that voice. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Kayla. But she was different. Her glow was gone, her silver hair dull, her eyes no longer swirling with that deep, mesmerizing blue. She looked human. "Kayla," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "Al, how are you here?" She stepped inside, her movements slow and deliberate. "The pod's destruction severed my connection to my people. It weakened them, but it also changed me. I'm not one of them anymore. I'm not sure what I am." Jake stood, his legs shaky. "You're alive," he said, his voice breaking. "That's all that matters." Kayla smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "For now, but my people won't stop. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll be stronger." Jake's chest tightened. "Then we'll be ready. Together." Kayla shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know how much time I have. Whatever the pod did to me, it's fading. I can feel it." Jake stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. Her touch was warm now, human. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "We'll find a way." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Maybe, but for now, we need to prepare. They'll come back, Jake. And when they do, we have to be ready." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll get to work. No more running. No more hiding. We fight." Kayla's smile returned, faint but genuine. Together, as they stood there, the fire crackling in the hearth, Jake felt a flicker of hope. They had a long road ahead, and the odds were against them. But they had each other, and for now, that was enough. But deep down, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, and Kayla, she was the key to it all. But as he looked at her, her human eyes meeting his, he knew they would face whatever came next, together. The night stretched on, the stars twinkling faintly through the cabin's windows. Somewhere out there, Kayla's people were regrouping, planning their next move. But for now, there was peace. And in that peace, Jake found a glimmer of hope. As the fire burned low and the cabin grew quiet, Jake and Kayla sat together, their hands intertwined. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were in this together. And no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Here is the story ends. If you enjoyed and want to watch more thrilling sci-fi adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Dive into epic battles, explore distant galaxies, and join brave heroes as they fight for survival against impossible odds. Let us know in comments if you want next chapters to publish soon. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of the journey. Together, we'll keep the last light burning. Subscribe now and let the adventure continue.